My name is Emily Rogers, and I am an MS MBA student. Within E-IPER, I defined a custom track to focus my studies on environmental systems and decision making. There are a lot of people without whose help this project would not have been possible, but in particular, I want to thank my advisor and my research partner. My advisor is Professor Paul Brest, the former dean of the law school, who has been such a wonderful mentor to me for the last year and a half. And my research partner, Ryan O'Connor, is an E-IPER PhD student, and he and I were doing our own research project when I stumbled upon these ideas around respectful research, which led me to my capstone. So how exactly did I come to have a project on respectful research within E-IPER? As I mentioned, Ryan and I were conducting a research project through E-IPER's collaboration grant. And our focus was on decision science principles, to take some of my background, and marine governance applications, to take some of Ryan's work. So we were looking into how decision science impacts the ways that we govern marine protected areas. And as we started narrowing down our case study region, I reached out to a Hawaiian professor to ask which of a couple of different Hawaiian marine protected areas could make a good fit for our research project. And the feedback that I got was tough. The professor, I included a snippet of her email on the slide here, said that my sense is that groups are busy, and this asks a lot of them by March today, and that it asks groups to fit the project versus the other way around. So I read that email and I felt embarrassed, and I felt like I had gone about this the wrong way. And what I didn't know is that it was going to lead me to discover these great fields of community-based research and respectful research. So community-based research, or CBR, is a type of research methodology where community members are equal partners throughout the entire research process. So everything from defining the research question through to actually conducting the project and then sharing the findings. It relies on the researcher having really strong relationships with the community members, and often includes multiple methods of information discovery and of actually sharing the findings to make sure that it's appropriate within the context of the community. CBR is often described as a spectrum based on just how involved the community is. And I've just put one up on the page. I actually came across at least 3 in my literature review. So it's a really common way that the community thinks about CBR, which is on the left-hand side of the page, the left-hand side of the spectrum. There's almost no community involvement. In fact, sometimes communities don't even know that there are research projects going on right in their backyard. And then through to the right-hand side of the spectrum, where we have the green and blue boxes, that's sort of what we think of as CBR, where you have community members as equal partners in the research practice. And even in the case of the furthest right-hand box, there are some times when community members are the ones who are driving the research themselves, and the more traditional academic researchers maybe are taking a back seat to that. So then a separate, very related field is this idea of respectful research. And there's a definition of respectful research that was used in a couple of the different literature sources I found, which is research that is sensitive to individual participants and research contexts, with both the researcher and participants benefiting. So this last part of the definition, with participants benefiting, that's really similar to the CBR idea of making sure that you have the communities actually benefiting from the work that you're doing with them. But where I think that there's a slight difference between CBR and respectful research is that CBR is really focused on how you engage with a community overall, whereas respectful research is a little bit more about how you're engaging with individuals. And one thing that I noticed about respectful research is there are great case studies in sensitive research environments. So examples that I saw were research in a women's prison, or research in a school where the students are all under the age of 18, and so you need to be extra sensitive. But I didn't actually find any case studies that talked about respectful research in the context of environmental projects. So I found these 2 great, really rich bodies of work, and I had no idea what to do with them. I felt a little bit overwhelmed, and probably more importantly, I was looking at these great lists of recommendations, and I was worried that I was going to do something wrong. I was going to make a mistake. And that's what led me to my capstone project. I wanted to be able to share my own experience and some of the recommendations that I found in the literature in a new way in order to help other researchers, and in particular students, engage with CBR and respectful research practices. I started with a core foundation of CBR practices and layered on top of those some of the additional respectful research practices that I learned either through my research or through the unstructured interviews I did with some experienced researchers in the field. I added to that my personal experience, which includes some vulnerability, a lot about talking about my own missteps and where I wish I had done things different. And my hope there is that it normalizes making mistakes. It's okay that we're all learning. And I turn these into my project deliverable, which is a case study on CBR and respectful research in environmental sciences. Now, my hope, I have to include a small theory of change with Professor Brest as my advisor. We love a good theory of change. My hope is that if this case study is used, particularly in classrooms, then researchers, and especially students who are maybe a bit newer to the field, are going to find a way to connect with these CBR and respectful research practices where they might not have had that pathway before. So let's get a little bit more into what the research process itself looks like. When I first thought about how I was going to share some of my work with you today, I was like, great, 6 research steps. I'll lay them out in my nice linear process and walk through them one by one. And that's when I realized that by calling this a linear process, I was going against a lot of the principles I had just learned about CBR. And so if I was encouraging us to start with research question formation and then get to case study region selection and work our way through step by step, then I was ignoring a lot of the principles about how do you actually integrate communities in throughout the entire process. So I visualized a slightly different process. And this is how I just thought about the research process for myself and what I wish it had looked like. So on the left-hand side, I have a loop of research question formation and case study region selection, really focusing on the fact that you have to iterate and hopefully you're actually drafting your research question with the case study region partners. And then once you've iterated on that, you can move forward through to the research method selection and conduct the research, and then to drawing the conclusions and sharing the findings. And for all of these, hopefully you're iterating, you're seeing what's working in the community and what's not, and you're changing your pathway based on that. Since I only have a little bit of time today, I'll just tell you a little bit about the first loop here. So going back to that research project that Ryan and I did, I'm going to tell you about how we approached our own process, and now, based on what I know, what I wish we had done instead. So when we were thinking about forming our research question and then also selecting our case study region area, this is how we went about it. We identified our overarching research topic, and then we said, okay, what's an interesting research question within that? We looked for a region that could then fit the case study or the case question that we had identified, and then we narrowed down our question a little bit based on the region itself. But what I wish we had done is, yes, started with that identifying that research topic, but then looking across multiple regions and actually engaging with the stakeholders there to understand what's important to them. Do they have overlapping needs with our research interests? And can we actually then co-develop a specific research question in a community that actually has interest in this type of research? And maybe you'll notice that, perhaps most importantly, selecting the research question moved from being one of the first steps in the process to what I would have liked to have been one of the last steps. And this would have addressed one of the concerns that was shared by that Hawaiian professor in the email, which is that we were asking the group to fit the project instead of the other way around. So what are some of the lessons and limitations to what I've just shared with you all? Start with a limitation, which is that I found it so challenging to do this all in the context of a shorter research project. And I would love to hear your suggestions during Q&A too as to how we can actually maybe tailor some of these approaches or even change the format in which, in particular, students are conducting research. Because I found it so hard to think about first identifying a research topic, doing the background research, identifying case study regions, actually talking to the stakeholders, co-developing a research question, and then conducting the research all in the context of a year, which is what Ryan and I had to do our project. Moving to the middle column, both a limitation and a lesson that I found is that there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. I would have loved to come in here today and tell you a list of best practices and steps that you could check off as you're conducting your own research, but the truth is the most important thing is for you to tailor your research practices to the environment you're in. And so while that means that I can't provide you with that neat little checklist, hopefully my experience is a lesson in just how important it is to actually tailor your research approach to the environment. And then last, perhaps my biggest lesson in all of this is I came into my work thinking one of the most important things I could do was to come across as this really bright Stanford graduate student who always knows the answer. What I found instead was the importance of doing my work with a lot of humility, not being afraid to admit mistakes and to learn from them. So I'm really excited to get your feedback and your questions in Q&A, and thanks for the time.
to see you present multiple times and see how far you've come between them. It's just amazing. Yeah, so I think this is such a great line of thought and inquiry. And, okay, I'm going to frame it in MBA speak. So I'd love to know what your go-to-market is, because I think this is such an important topic. Not just how do we do community-based research, but how do we engage respectfully in the relationships we develop through partnerships. And we all need to learn that as we're trying to do that. So what's your go-to-market for helping us all learn that?
Yeah, well, this is not super helpful to PhD students, but when we were actually doing our practice presentations last week, there was an undergraduate student who works for OCT, on-campus oral communications tutoring, something like that. And she approached me after my practice presentation and said, all the sophomores are required to take a class, PWR2, and it's a research class where they have to learn about how to actually design a research project. And I can defer to some of the Stanford undergraduate or former undergraduates in the room who can jump in and correct me if I'm misrepresenting here. But the idea is that they're learning about all these research methods, and I think that that's the exact right opportunity to then be able to deploy this case study. So I've actually been connected with the director of that program. Hopefully, we'll see if it ends up being my case study is as helpful as I hope it will be, but would love for that to be sort of one of the avenues in which this is used. Yeah, Lana.
Yeah, I think it was fascinating. It seems intuitive, but I just listening to you talk was the first time I really thought about the fact that, as the timeline you have to do your research shortens, perhaps there's this sort of not great synergy, at least on its face, with doing respectful research and community-based research. And so in your sort of scrape of the literature, just interacting so much with this question, did anyone you read about sort of parlay with this question of short research timelines versus a process that by almost maybe on its face by its nature is requires more than just coming in real fast and extracting information?
I actually found the opposite, which is a bit of a bummer, which is that I read about these projects where people were saying, I engaged in this work for 10 years, and I had this research question my first 2 years, and then I was able to change it because I got to know the community. And I was like, well, that's too bad. I would love to have 10 years. I think, one thing that was really interesting, I was connecting with the person who leads CBR work through Stanford's Haas Center for Public Service. And what he was saying is what they try to do for students is they find relationships that they've already established or projects that they've already started, and then they kind of drop students into those. And so it's different because you don't get to go through that whole exploration as a student of what am I interested in, how can that fit a community? But I think that that's one okay solve to it, which is at least if you're working off of existing relationships, then you avoid some of the challenges that I faced.
I'm curious because I feel like you're in a room of E-IPER students that are thinking about this, or maybe, right, that at least I imagine that this is really top of mind. Have you engaged with researchers who don't feel as strongly that this is important, and how has that gone? I'm curious.
Yeah, I had a conversation actually yesterday where it was more about a concern with CBR, which is what do you do if you're going to an area that has multiple communities that don't see eye to eye? And that's something that I hadn't really thought about because particularly in the context of my research, it was, we were trying to narrow down to one really small community and then work within that. But I think it's a really good call out of how do you then balance if there's multiple communities that maybe don't want the same thing out of a research process, how do you think about that? And I don't have a good answer to that, so maybe it's just some food for thought for us all to think about. But I do think that I've seen sort of the very pro CBR researchers and professors. And then I went through 2+ years at Stanford without ever learning about CBR. So I do think that it's not necessarily the academic norm right now. And I wonder if there are some areas where it should be, and then maybe other areas where actually doing traditional research is still what makes the most sense.